A waitress approached a millionaire and told him not to travel with his wife. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble home. The evening had unfolded like any other at the small but cozy restaurant on the outskirts of Boston. Emily adjusted her apron for the umpteenth time, her hands brushing against the notepad tucked into its pocket. The warm hum of conversations mixed with the clinking of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. She had grown used to this rhythm, finding a strange comfort in the predictable chaos of serving tables. But tonight was different. Near the corner booth, a couple exuded a quiet kind of wealth. The man, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, had the commanding presence of someone who was used to being in control. His companion, an elegant woman with blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Emily had seen them before. Edward, a regular, and his wife, Rachel. They were hard to miss, not just because of their polished appearances, but because of the undeniable tension that seemed to linger between them. Emily approached their table with practiced ease. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice polite but detached. Edward glanced up, offering a distracted, "No, thank you," while Rachel dismissed her with a curt shake of her head. Her words hung in the air as Emily stepped away, a tinge of discomfort brushing against her usual professionalism. There was something about Rachel's demeanor tonight, aloof yet charged like a storm waiting to break. Edward, on the other hand, seemed preoccupied, his attention on his phone rather than his companion. As Emily tended to the next table, her ears caught snippets of their conversation. Rachel's voice was low, her words clipped. "You're always so focused on work," she said, a hint of irritation breaking through her otherwise measured tone. Edward murmured something in response, his voice too soft to carry over the ambient noise of the restaurant. Minutes later, Edward excused himself to the restroom. Leaving Rachel alone at the table, Emily had just passed by their booth, heading to clear plates from another group. When Rachel pulled out her phone, the woman's face, calm and composed, moments before, transformed into something colder, sharper. "No, he doesn't suspect a thing," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's hum. Emily froze, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. "Yes, the trip is still on. By the time he realizes, it'll be too late." There was a pause, followed by a chilling laugh. "Don't worry. He's too busy with his work to notice anything." Emily's heart raced. Her first instinct was to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't heard a word. After all, what could she possibly do? She was a waitress, not some detective or hero in a movie. But as she turned to the kitchen, her thoughts swirled. What trip? Too late for what? She didn't know Edward well, but he'd always been polite. Tipping generously and thanking her by name, the thought of him being betrayed, whatever Rachel's plan was, left a sour taste in her mouth. When Edward returned to the table, Rachel's demeanor shifted again, her expression softening into a practiced smile. Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of unease as she watched the couple. How could he not see through her? Or maybe he did, and he was just too tired to care. The night dragged on, and Emily couldn't shake what she had heard. Every time she approached their table, she felt a weight pressing on her chest. She debated saying something, but the risks felt too high. What if Edward didn't believe her? What if Rachel found out? The woman didn't seem like someone who took kindly to interference. It wasn't until closing time that Emily found her chance. Edward stood near the entrance, adjusting his coat as Rachel lingered at the counter, chatting with the hostess. Emily's pulse quickened. This was her moment. If she let it pass, she might never have the opportunity again. She hesitated, her palms sweaty and her heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "Forgive me for the intrusion, but don't travel with your wife." Edward frowned, his piercing blue eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Emily swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "I can't explain now, but just trust me. Please." For a moment, he looked like he might brush her off. His expression was unreadable, a mix of confusion and irritation. Then, something in her voice, or perhaps the desperation in her eyes, made him pause. He nodded slowly, though the hesitation was clear. "Thank you," he said, though doubt flickered in his gaze. Rachel called his name, her tone light but firm, and Edward turned away, leaving Emily standing there with her thoughts in turmoil. Had she done the right thing? Would he even take her seriously? Walking home that night under the glow of the streetlights, Emily couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head. The air was crisp, and the faint scent of rain lingered from an earlier drizzle. Her small apartment was only a few blocks away, but the journey felt endless. She didn't know if Edward would heed her warning, but something inside her told her she had done what she could. As she reached her door and fumbled with her keys, Emily glanced back at the empty street behind her. A chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't say why. It wasn't just the cold or the quiet. It was the feeling that she had just set something in motion, something far bigger than she could imagine. The next morning, Edward sat in his office, staring blankly at the large window that overlooked the city. The light streaming in did little to chase away the unease that had settled over him. He tried to shake it off, brushing Emily's cryptic warning aside as the nervous rambling of a stranger, but her words gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Stubborn and insistent. Don't travel with your wife. It was such a bizarre statement, but there had been something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and urgency, that he couldn't ignore. The rest of his morning was consumed by meetings and calls, but the memory of Emily's trembling voice refused to fade. By lunchtime, he couldn't take it anymore. Edward leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Mason, it's Edward," he said, his voice steady but clipped. "I need you to look into something for me." Mason Harris was more than just Edward's lawyer. He was also a trusted confidant who had helped him navigate countless personal and professional storms. "What kind of something are we talking about?" Mason asked, his tone light but curious. Edward hesitated for a moment, glancing at the photo of Rachel on his desk. In the picture, her smile was radiant, her arm looped around his, but now, the image felt hollow. "I need you to investigate Rachel," he said finally, his voice low. "Specifically, if there's any reason I should be concerned about her upcoming trip." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't," Edward replied firmly. "Keep this discreet. I don't want her to know." Mason agreed, though not without a hint of skepticism. Edward ended the call, feeling a strange mix of guilt and relief. He had always prided himself on being a man of logic and reason, but something about Emily's warning had shaken that foundation. For the first time in years, he was letting his instincts lead. Days passed, and Edward threw himself into work to distract himself. Rachel, meanwhile, acted as if nothing was amiss. She floated through their shared penthouse with the same grace and poise she always had. But Edward began to notice things he had ignored before, the way she avoided direct answers to his questions, the way her phone never left her side when Mason called back. Edward was in his car, stuck in traffic on his way home. "We need to talk," Mason said, his voice unusually grave. "Tell me now," Edward insisted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. There was a brief pause before Mason spoke again. "I had a private investigator follow Rachel for the past few days. She's been meeting with someone, a man, in secret." Edward's stomach clenched. "Who is he?" "We're still trying to identify him," Mason admitted. "But there's more. Rachel has been funneling money out of your joint accounts into an offshore account. It's been happening for months." The weight of the revelation hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He pulled over to the side of the road, unable to focus on anything but the flood of emotions crashing over him. Betrayal, anger, humiliation. He had always known their marriage wasn't perfect. But this was a level of deceit he hadn't anticipated. Mason's voice brought him back to reality. "Edward, are you still there?" "I'm here," Edward said, though his voice was strained. "Keep digging. I want to know everything." That evening, Edward returned to the penthouse to find Rachel in the living room, sipping wine and scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "You're home late," she said casually. Edward forced a tight smile. "Work was demanding, as always." Rachel nodded, setting her glass down. "Well, don't forget, our trip is next week. I've already started packing." He watched her for a moment, the image of calm and elegance. For years, he had admired her composure, her ability to glide through life unbothered. But now, that same composure felt like a mask, one he was determined to see through. "I've had a change of plans," Edward said, keeping his tone neutral. "I can't make the trip." Rachel blinked, surprised. What? Why? Work, he lied smoothly. Something's come up and I can't get away. For a split second, a flicker of something, disappointment, frustration, crossed her face, but she quickly recovered, offering a practiced smile. That's too bad. I suppose I'll just have to go without you. Edward nodded, forcing himself to maintain his composure. I trust you'll enjoy yourself. Later that night, as Rachel disappeared into their bedroom, Edward sat alone in his office. The silence was suffocating. He reached for his phone and dialed Mason again. Keep the investigator on her, he said quietly. I need to know exactly what she's planning. As he hung up, his thoughts drifted to Emily. The young waitress had no idea how much her simple warning had unraveled the delicate fabric of his life. But for the first time in a long time, Edward felt something unfamiliar. Clarity. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The truth was coming, and he was ready to face it. The restaurant was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of calm that often preceded a rush. Emily wiped down tables with quick, practiced motions, her mind a whirl of thoughts. It had been days since she'd spoken to Edward, and she couldn't help but wonder if he had taken her warning seriously. Part of her regretted saying anything at all. After all, what business did she have interfering in the life of someone like him? The sound of the front door opening drew her attention. Emily turned, and her breath caught. Standing there, with his usual air of quiet authority, was Edward. But tonight, he looked different. His shoulders were stiff, his face drawn, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. Emily, he said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. She froze, her rag still clutched in one hand. Mr. Stone, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He closed the distance between them in a few measured strides. I need to speak with you, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Emily glanced nervously at her manager, who was stationed behind the counter. The older woman gave a slight nod, signaling that it was okay. Reluctantly, Emily set down the rag and followed Edward to one of the empty booths. The silence stretched between them as Edward sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Emily considered bolting. Instead, she took a deep breath and sat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. I owe you an explanation, Edward began, his voice softer now. And I owe you my thanks. Emily blinked, caught off guard. You do, he nodded. I didn't understand it at first, what you said to me that night, but I followed your advice, and because of that, I uncovered something I wouldn't have otherwise. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. You were right. Rachel isn't who I thought she was. Emily's heart sank. She had hoped, foolishly, that maybe she had been wrong about Rachel's intentions, but hearing it confirmed brought little satisfaction. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Don't be, Edward replied, his tone firm. You did something most people wouldn't have. You told the truth when you didn't have to. And that's something I respect. Emily didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to receiving praise, especially from someone like Edward. I couldn't stay quiet after what I heard, she admitted. It didn't feel right. Edward leaned back in his seat, studying her. And because of that, you saved me from a situation that could have been disastrous. I owe you more than just thanks. Emily's cheeks flushed under his intense gaze. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Stone. I was just doing what I thought was right. He smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth she'd seen from him that evening. Please call me Edward, and whether you like it or not, I do owe you, which brings me to why I'm here. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek envelope, setting it on the table between them. Emily stared at it, confused. What's this? It's a job offer, Edward said simply. I'd like you to come work for me. The words hit her like a freight train. Work for you, she repeated, incredulous. Yes, he said, his tone matter of fact. I need someone I can trust, someone who's not afraid to speak the truth. After what happened, I can't think of anyone better. Emily shook her head, disbelief etched across her face. I don't know the first thing about working in your world. I'm just a waitress. You're more than that, Edward countered. You're smart, perceptive, and you have a moral compass. Qualities that are hard to find these days. I can teach you everything else. She hesitated, her mind racing. The offer was tempting, especially considering her current struggles. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and her younger siblings depended on her for everything, but stepping into Edward's world felt like stepping into uncharted territory, and that terrified her. "I don't know," she said finally. "It's a lot to think about." Edward nodded as if he'd expected her hesitation. "Take your time, but if you decide to accept, know that you'll have my full support. I won't let you fail." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. She glanced down at the envelope, her fingers twitching with the urge to pick it up. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Out of all the people you could have chosen." "Why me?" "Because you did something no one else has," Edward said, his gaze steady. "You told me the truth when it mattered most. That's something I won't forget." Before she could respond, Edward stood, adjusting his jacket. "I'll leave you to think about it," he said. "Take as long as you need." Emily watched as he walked to the door, his presence as commanding as ever. But just before he stepped outside, he turned back and offered her a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then he was gone, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and the envelope. As the door swung shut behind him, Emily exhaled, the weight of the conversation settling over her. She stared at the envelope for a long time before slipping it into her apron. Her shift wasn't over yet, but her mind was already consumed by what lay inside, and the decision she would have to make. The envelope sat on Emily's small kitchen table, its crisp edges and weight seeming to taunt her. She had placed it there the night before, staring at it like it was some kind of foreign object. The temptation to open it was overwhelming, but fear held her back. What if accepting Edward's offer was a mistake? What if she failed? Morning light filtered through the curtains of her modest apartment, casting soft shadows across the room. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she finally broke the seal. Inside was a letter, elegantly printed on thick, expensive paper. It outlined the details of the position Edward had offered her: assistant to the CEO, with responsibilities that included managing schedules, overseeing correspondence, and ensuring discretion in all matters. The salary alone made her heart skip a beat. It was more money than she'd ever imagined earning, enough to pay off her mother's medical bills and secure a better future for her siblings. But the magnitude of the opportunity made her feel small. What did she know about being an assistant to someone like Edward Stone? She wasn't polished or experienced in the corporate world. Her life had been defined by scraping by, not excelling in high-powered environments. Her mother's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You've been staring at that paper for an hour, Kirita. What's on your mind?" Emily looked up to see her mother leaning against the doorway. Frail but smiling softly, the toll of her illness was evident in her sunken cheeks and the way she clutched the doorframe for support. "It's an offer," Emily said, folding the letter nervously. "A job." Her mother raised an eyebrow. "A good one," Emily nodded. "It's a great one, actually, but I don't know if I can do it." Her mother shuffled closer, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Mija, you've always doubted yourself, but I've seen what you're capable of. If this is a chance to change your life, you owe it to yourself, and to us, to try." Emily swallowed hard, her mother's words sinking in. She thought about her siblings, who deserved more than the cramped apartment they lived in. She thought about the long hours she spent waitressing, barely making enough to cover their needs. Maybe this was her chance to give them a better life. Later that day, Emily found herself outside Edward's office building. The towering glass structure loomed above her, a stark reminder of the divide between their worlds. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the cool air conditioning hitting her like a wave. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile and directed her to the top floor. When the elevator doors opened, Emily was greeted by a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city. The sleek modern design was intimidating, but what struck her most was the quiet efficiency of the place. People moved with purpose, their expressions focused. Edward appeared from his office, his presence commanding as always. He smiled faintly when he saw her. "Emily, I wasn't sure if you'd come." She straightened her posture, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "I thought about it a lot," she admitted. "And I want to take the job." A flicker of relief crossed his face. "Good. You've made the right choice." He led her into his office, a space as impressive as the man himself, as he explained the intricacies of her new role. Emily listened intently, jotting down notes in the notebook he provided. It was overwhelming, but Edward's calm, steady demeanor put her at ease. The first few days were a whirlwind. Emily was thrown into a world she barely understood, one filled with board meetings, high-stakes decisions, and an unspoken code of conduct that she struggled to decipher. But she worked tirelessly, determined to prove herself. She stayed late, studied company protocols, and asked questions whenever she was unsure. Still, not everyone was thrilled about her sudden arrival. Some of Edward's employees eyed her with skepticism, whispering behind her back. She wasn't oblivious to their judgment, the way they saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. It stung, but Emily refused to let it show. Edward, however, seemed unfazed by the office gossip. He continued to treat her with respect, offering guidance when needed, but also trusting her to handle her responsibilities. His confidence in her was both reassuring and daunting, a reminder that she couldn't afford to fail. One evening, as Emily worked late, Edward appeared in her office with 2 cups of coffee. He set one down on her desk and leaned against the doorframe. "How are you holding up?" he asked. She looked up, startled by the unexpected gesture. "I'm managing," she said with a small smile. "It's a lot to take in, but I'm trying." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I also knew you could handle it. You're proving me right." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, and she took a sip of the coffee to hide her embarrassment. "Thank you," she said softly. As Edward left, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. She wasn't just working for him. She was working for her family, for a chance at a better life. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was capable of achieving it. The next morning, Emily stepped into Edward's office building with a mix of nervous anticipation and determination. Her uniform of crisp slacks and a fitted blouse felt like armor against the unspoken scrutiny she sensed from others. The previous days had been a whirlwind, but today, she vowed to focus on learning the nuances of Edward's world, one that felt as alien to her as it was exhilarating. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, where polished glass walls and minimalist decor seemed to whisper of wealth and power. Emily adjusted her bag on her shoulder, clutching her notebook tightly as she approached her desk. It was strategically placed just outside Edward's office, signaling her proximity to the CEO himself. "Good morning," Edward said as he passed by, his tailored suit impeccable as always. There was no hint of the storm that had engulfed his personal life, no crack in the composed facade he presented to the world. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," she replied, still getting used to the formality of her new role. Edward paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Emily, I told you to call me Edward." She nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Good morning, Edward." Satisfied, he continued into his office, leaving Emily to settle in. She glanced at her calendar for the day, noting a string of meetings, calls, and tasks that demanded meticulous attention. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she began organizing Edward's agenda, answering emails and preparing materials for the morning's first meeting. As she worked, snippets of conversation drifted from the office nearby. Senior executives and department heads entered and exited Edward's office, their voices low but urgent. Emily recognized some of the names from company briefings she'd pored over in her spare time. Determined to familiarize herself with the key players in Edward's empire, by mid-morning, Emily accompanied Edward to a boardroom meeting, her notebook in hand. The room was filled with influential figures, men and women whose suits and poised expressions spoke of years spent navigating the intricacies of the corporate world. Emily felt their eyes on her as she took a seat at the edge of the room, her presence acknowledged with polite nods. Edward began the meeting with the same commanding presence that had drawn her attention in the restaurant. He spoke with clarity and confidence, addressing financial reports, expansion strategies, and market trends with ease. Emily watched in awe, her pen scribbling notes as she tried to keep up. Halfway through the meeting, one of the executives, Margaret Reynolds, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of experience, turned her attention to Emily. "And who might you be?" she asked, her tone cool but not unkind. Emily straightened her posture, her heart pounding. "I'm Emily Alvarez, Mr. Stone's assistant." Margaret's gaze lingered for a moment before she offered a curt nod. "Well, let's hope you're up to the task," Edward intervened smoothly. "She is," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Margaret raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. The exchange left Emily both rattled and determined. She knew she was being judged, her every move scrutinized, but she also knew she couldn't afford to falter. Edward's confidence in her was a lifeline, one she was determined not to squander. The day continued in a blur of tasks and interactions. Emily navigated phone calls, scheduled appointments, and compiled reports, her focus unyielding. By late afternoon, she found herself in Edward's office, reviewing a presentation he had asked her to prepare. "This is good," he said, scanning the slides she'd put together. "Clean, concise, you're getting the hang of this." Emily exhaled, relief washing over her. "Thank you. I've been trying to keep up with everything." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're doing more than keeping up, Emily. You're excelling, and I don't say that lightly." Her cheeks warmed under his gaze, but she managed a small smile. "I just want to do a good job. For you and for the company." Edward's expression softened. "You're doing that and more. I hired you because I saw potential, and you've already exceeded my expectations." The compliment bolstered her confidence, but it also reminded her of the stakes. Edward wasn't just her boss. He was a man whose trust she had earned in an unconventional way, and she was determined not to let him down. As the evening approached, Emily packed up her desk, her body aching from the long hours, but her spirit buoyed by a sense of accomplishment. Edward walked her to the elevator, an unexpected gesture that caught her off guard. "You handled yourself well today," he said, as they waited for the doors to open. "Thank you," she replied, feeling the weight of his approval. As the elevator descended, Emily thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. She was no longer just a waitress, struggling to make ends meet. She was stepping into a world of opportunities, challenges, and possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But as she stepped out onto the street and began her walk home, the doubts crept back in. Could she truly keep up with this life? Could she navigate the complexities of Edward's world while staying true to herself? Emily pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of her footsteps. One day at a time, she told herself. That was the only way forward. The days turned into weeks, and Emily began to settle into her new role. The initial unease she had felt navigating Edward's world was gradually replaced by a sense of determination. Her mornings started early, often before the sun rose, and her evenings stretched late into the night. The long hours were grueling, but Emily refused to let exhaustion overtake her. She had a point to prove, not just to Edward, but to herself. Her routine became second nature, organizing Edward's schedule, responding to a mountain of emails, and preparing materials for his meetings. She found herself learning the intricate dynamics of his company, from its ambitious expansions to the subtle politics among the senior executives. Slowly, she began to feel more confident in her abilities, though she knew she still had much to learn. Edward, ever the enigmatic figure, seemed to take notice. He had a way of appearing at just the right moments, offering a word of encouragement or a suggestion that sharpened her focus. His presence was both reassuring and intimidating, a constant reminder of the high expectations she had to meet. One afternoon, as Emily was buried in spreadsheets, Edward's voice broke her concentration. "Emily, do you have a moment?" She looked up to find him standing at the doorway of her office, his expression calm but intent. "Of course," she said, rising quickly from her chair. Edward gestured for her to follow him. They walked down the sleek hallway to the executive lounge, a space Emily rarely entered. The room was bathed in natural light, its plush seating and minimalist decor exuding understated luxury. Edward poured himself a cup of coffee and offered her one, which she accepted hesitantly. "I thought it might be nice to take a break," he said, settling into one of the armchairs. "You've been working non-stop." Emily smiled faintly. "There's a lot to do." "There always is," he agreed, his tone lighter than usual. "But even the best need to breathe every now and then." She hesitated before sitting across from him, the coffee cup warm in her hands. It was rare to see Edward in a relaxed setting like this. He was usually all business, his focus razor sharp. Here he seemed almost human. "I've been meaning to ask," he began, his gaze steady. "How are you finding the job so far?" Emily considered her words carefully. "It's challenging," she admitted, "but I like it." I feel like I'm learning something new every day. He nodded, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. You're doing well. Better than well, actually. I wasn't wrong about you. The compliment caught her off guard. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. There was a pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Emily took a sip of her coffee, unsure of what to say next. It was Edward who broke the silence. You remind me of someone I used to know, he said, his voice quieter now. Someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for what they believed in, even when it wasn't easy. Emily tilted her head, curious. Who? He hesitated, his gaze distant. My mother, he said finally. She was the one person in my life who always told me the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. Emily blinked, surprised by the personal revelation. Edward rarely spoke about himself, and when he did, it was usually in the context of business. This glimpse into his past felt like a privilege, one she didn't take lightly. She sounds like she was an incredible woman, Emily said gently. She was, Edward replied, his voice tinged with sadness. I've tried to live by her example, but, well, life has a way of testing your resolve. The vulnerability in his words caught her off guard. For all his power and success, Edward was still a man who carried his own burdens. It made him seem less untouchable, more real. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening slightly. Duty calls, he said, rising from his chair. Thank you for humoring me, Emily. She stood as well, a faint smile on her lips. Anytime, as they walked back to their offices, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the newfound ease with which they spoke. It was the understanding that had passed between them in the lounge. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just an employee to Edward. She was someone he trusted. The weeks that followed were marked by a subtle but undeniable change in their dynamic. Edward began seeking her input on matters beyond her typical duties, asking her opinion during meetings and valuing her perspective. It was a level of trust she hadn't expected, and it filled her with both pride and a growing sense of responsibility. But with that trust came a new kind of tension. Emily found herself increasingly aware of Edward in ways she hadn't before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the calm authority in his voice, the rare moments of warmth that broke through his exterior. She dismissed the thoughts as foolish, but they lingered nonetheless. One evening, as she was leaving the office, Edward caught her at the elevator. Emily, he said, his voice softer than usual. Thank you for everything. She blinked, startled by the sincerity in his tone. I'm just doing my job. He shook his head, a small smile on his lips. You're doing much more than that. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped back, allowing her to leave. As the doors closed, Emily felt a strange mix of emotions. Gratitude, pride, and something she couldn't quite name. It was an unusually hectic morning in the office. Emily was juggling Edward's packed schedule, replying to urgent emails, and preparing reports for an upcoming board meeting. The rhythm was relentless, but she'd grown accustomed to the pace. She thrived on the challenge, her confidence growing with every passing day. As she typed furiously on her keyboard, a voice cut through the noise of her thoughts. Well, so you're the famous new assistant. Emily looked up to see a strikingly beautiful woman standing by her desk. Rachel. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a designer dress that screamed effortless elegance. But her sharp smile and the calculating gleam in her eyes sent a chill down Emily's spine. Mrs. Stone, Emily said, keeping her tone neutral. She hadn't expected to encounter Rachel in the office, and the sudden appearance unsettled her. It's Rachel, the woman corrected, her smile widening. No need for formalities. She leaned against the edge of the desk, her presence invasive. You've been quite the topic of conversation lately. Emily frowned slightly, unsure of what Rachel was implying. How can I help you? Rachel tilted her head, studying Emily like a predator sizing up its prey. Oh, I just wanted to meet the person who's been occupying so much of Edward's time. You must be very talented. The words dripped with sarcasm, and Emily felt the weight of Rachel's insinuation. She forced herself to remain calm. I do my best to support Mr. Stone in his work, she replied evenly. Rachel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "I'm sure you do, but let me give you a little advice, dear. In this world, loyalty is everything. People who forget their place often find themselves replaced." Emily's stomach twisted at the veiled threat, but she refused to show any weakness. "Thank you for the advice, Rachel. I'll be sure to keep that in mind." Rachel straightened, her smile icy. "Good. I'd hate to see you get caught up in something you don't understand." With that, she turned on her heel and strode toward Edward's office, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Emily exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. She'd known Rachel was manipulative, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. Inside Edward's office, the muffled sound of voices reached her ears. Rachel's tone was sharp, her words carrying a venom that made Emily's skin crawl. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear the conversation was heated. Minutes later, the door swung open, and Rachel stormed out, her expression dark. She didn't spare Emily a glance as she disappeared down the hallway. Edward emerged shortly after, his jaw tight and his expression clouded with frustration. "Emily," he said, his tone clipped, "could you come in for a moment?" She nodded and followed him into the office, her heart pounding. Edward closed the door behind her and leaned against his desk, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry about that," he said finally. "Rachel has a way of making her presence disruptive." Emily hesitated before responding. "She seems upset." Edward let out a humorless laugh. "That's putting it mildly." He met her gaze, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "She's not happy about the divorce proceedings, and she's using every opportunity to stir up trouble." Emily nodded, unsure of what to say. She felt out of her depth, caught in the crossfire of a personal battle that was far beyond her control. "Has she said anything to you?" Edward asked, his tone softening. Emily hesitated. She didn't want to cause more tension, but she also knew she couldn't lie to him. "She implied that I should be careful," she admitted, "but I can handle it." Edward's expression darkened, and he straightened, his posture rigid. "You shouldn't have to," he said firmly. "Rachel has no right to interfere in your work. I'll make sure she understands that." "Edward." "It's fine," Emily said quickly. "Really, I don't want to cause any more trouble." "You're not causing trouble," he said, his voice resolute. "Rachel is, and I won't let her intimidate you." The sincerity in his words warmed something in Emily's chest, but it also made her uneasy. She didn't want to become a source of conflict between Edward and Rachel. No matter how toxic their relationship had become, the rest of the day passed in a blur. Emily tried to focus on her work, but Rachel's visit lingered in her mind. She could still feel the weight of the woman's gaze, the unspoken threat in her words. It was a reminder that no matter how far she had come, there were still obstacles she couldn't control. As the office emptied out for the evening, Emily found herself alone at her desk, her thoughts heavy. She glanced toward Edward's office, the lights still on inside. She knew he was dealing with his own battles, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's games were far from over. When Edward finally emerged, his expression was softer than before. "You should go home," he said gently. "It's been a long day." Emily offered a small smile. "I was just finishing up." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "Thank you for everything today, Emily. I don't say it enough, but I appreciate you." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "It's my job," she said quietly. "It's more than that," Edward replied. "Good night, Emily." "Good night," she said, watching as he disappeared down the hallway. As she gathered her things and headed for the elevator, Emily couldn't help but feel a growing sense of resolve. Rachel might have tried to shake her, but she wouldn't let it break her. She was here for a reason, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away. The days following Rachel's visit were tense. Emily couldn't help but feel as though she was being watched, her every move under a microscope. Gossip swirled among the office staff, their whispers barely concealed as she walked by. Words like favoritism and inexperience floated through the air, sharp enough to sting. It was clear that Rachel's presence had stirred the pot, and Emily was now at the center of the storm, but she refused to let it show. She threw herself into her work with even greater focus. Her days filled with meetings, reports, and last-minute tasks that Edward entrusted to her. His confidence in her abilities was the anchor she clung to. even as doubt threatened to creep in. She reminded herself why she had taken the job in the first place, to support her family and to prove, to herself and others, that she was capable of more than they thought. One afternoon, as she prepared materials for an upcoming investor presentation, Margaret Reynolds, the sharp-eyed executive who had questioned Emily in her first boardroom meeting, approached her desk. "You've been busy," Margaret said, her tone neutral but her expression hard to read. "Yes, there's a lot to get through," Emily replied, keeping her voice polite. Margaret glanced at the stack of folders on Emily's desk. "Word around the office is that Rachel isn't too pleased with you. That's not a position I'd envy." Emily met Margaret's gaze, her stomach tightening. "I'm just doing my job," she said simply. Margaret studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. Keep doing that. And don't let the noise distract you." With that, she walked away, leaving Emily both surprised and slightly reassured. It wasn't exactly a vote of confidence, but it wasn't a criticism either. Later that day, Emily found herself in the middle of another test of her resolve. During a team briefing, one of the department heads, a man named Simon, openly challenged her preparation of the presentation materials. "These figures seem off," Simon said, flipping through the documents with a dismissive air. "I'm not sure we can rely on them." Emily's cheeks burned under the scrutiny of the room. "Those figures are based on the latest reports from the finance department," she explained, keeping her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety in her chest. Simon raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you should double-check with finance next time. We can't afford errors at this level." Before Emily could respond, Edward spoke up, his tone sharp. "Simon, if there's an issue with the data, I expect you to bring it to my attention, not question my assistant's work in front of the team." Simon blinked, caught off guard by Edward's firm defense. "Of course, Mr. Stone," he said, his tone noticeably more subdued. Edward turned to Emily, his gaze steady. "Thank you for your work on this. I trust the data is accurate." Emily nodded, her voice quiet but resolute. "It is." The meeting continued, but Emily could feel the tension dissipating, replaced by a renewed sense of confidence. Edward's public support had sent a clear message. He trusted her, and so should everyone else. After the meeting, Edward caught up with her in the hallway. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," she said, though her pulse was still racing. "Thank you for backing me up in there." "You earned it," he replied, his expression softening. "Don't let people like Simon shake you. They'll always find something to criticize, but that doesn't mean they're right." His words stayed with her as she returned to her desk. Emily knew she still had a long way to go, but moments like these reminded her that she wasn't alone in this journey. That evening, as she gathered her things to leave, Rachel's parting words echoed in her mind. People who forget their place often find themselves replaced. For a brief moment, she felt the weight of those words, the fear of failure creeping back in. But then she thought of her family, their laughter, their struggles, their unwavering faith in her, and the fear melted away. When Emily stepped into the elevator, she found Edward already inside, his tie loosened and his expression tired but calm. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yes," she said, offering him a small smile. "It's been a long day." He nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You handled yourself well today. I'm proud of you." Her heart swelled at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot." As the elevator descended, a comfortable silence settled between them. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of clarity. She didn't need Rachel's approval or the validation of the office gossip. She had earned her place here, and no one could take that away from her. When the elevator doors opened, Edward turned to her. "Have a good night, Emily." "You too," she replied, stepping out into the cool evening air. Walking home, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. Rachel might have tried to shake her, but Emily had faced far greater challenges in her life. She wasn't just here to survive. She was here to thrive, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even Rachel, stand in her way. The day of the corporate gala had arrived, an event where the company's top executives, investors, and influential figures mingled in an opulent ballroom under glittering chandeliers. Emily stood in front of the mirror in her modest apartment, adjusting the hem of the elegant navy blue dress Edward had arranged for her. She felt out of place in the finery, But she knew tonight was important. Edward had insisted on her attendance, emphasizing the value of her presence as part of his team. When Emily arrived at the venue, she was greeted by the buzz of conversation and the clink of glasses. The room was filled with people who exuded wealth and confidence, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. Emily felt a wave of nerves but pushed them aside, reminding herself why she was here. "Emily," Edward's familiar voice cut through the crowd. She turned to see him approaching, his tailored tuxedo accentuating his commanding presence. "You made it." "Of course," she said, offering a small smile. "Thank you for inviting me." "You belong here," he replied, his tone firm. "Don't forget that." His words were a comfort as they moved through the room together. Exchanging pleasantries with attendees, Emily stayed close to Edward, observing how effortlessly he navigated the social landscape. She admired his ability to command attention without arrogance, his every move deliberate and confident. But the evening's tranquility was soon shattered from across the room. Rachel's presence was impossible to ignore. She entered with all the grace of a seasoned socialite, her red gown a statement of power and defiance. Her eyes locked onto Emily almost immediately, a predatory smile curling on her lips. Emily's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to stand tall. As the evening progressed, Rachel made her way to Emily, her movements deliberate. Edward had been momentarily pulled away by a conversation with an investor, leaving Emily vulnerable. "Emily," Rachel said, her tone syrupy sweet. "You're quite the rising star, aren't you?" "Good evening, Rachel," Emily replied, keeping her voice polite but cautious. Rachel's smile widened, but her eyes were cold. "It's fascinating, really. A waitress one moment, and now here you are, rubbing shoulders with the elite. Quite the Cinderella story." The comment stung, but Emily refused to let it show. "I'm just doing my job," she said evenly. "Of course," Rachel said, her voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Though I wonder how much of your success is due to your talents, and how much is due to Edward's generosity." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Nearby guests turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. Emily's cheeks burned, but she kept her composure. "I've earned my place here through hard work," she said, meeting Rachel's gaze. "Nothing more, nothing less." Rachel laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "If you say so," she said, her tone dismissive. "But be careful, dear. People like you don't last long in this world." Before Emily could respond, Edward appeared beside her, his expression a mask of calm fury. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but firm, "is there a reason you're speaking to my assistant in that tone?" Rachel's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "Edward, darling, I was just making conversation. No need to be so protective." Edward's eyes narrowed. "I suggest you keep your conversation professional. Emily is here because she's earned it, and I won't tolerate anyone suggesting otherwise." The crowd around them fell silent, the tension palpable. Rachel's cheeks flushed with anger, but she said nothing, her gaze flicking between Edward and Emily. Finally, she turned on her heel and walked away, her head held high. Edward turned to Emily, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Emily nodded, though her heart was still pounding. "I'm fine. Thank you. You handled that well," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "Rachel thrives on intimidation. You didn't let her win." The evening continued, but the encounter left Emily shaken. She couldn't escape the whispers that followed her wherever she went, the speculative glances from people who had witnessed the exchange. Still, she reminded herself that Edward's defense had sent a clear message. She wasn't alone in this fight. As the gala wound down, Edward approached her once more, his expression thoughtful. "I want to thank you for everything you've done," he said. "Not just tonight, but in general. You've been an invaluable part of this team." Emily's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze. "I'm just doing my job," she said, echoing her earlier words. "You're doing much more than that," he replied, his voice steady. "And I hope you know how much I appreciate it." As the night came to a close, Emily left the venue with a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel's attempt to humiliate her had backfired, thanks to Edward's unwavering support. For the first time, Emily felt truly secure in her place in Edward's world. But deep down, She knew this was just the beginning. Rachel wasn't the type to back down easily, and Emily would have to be ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the gala lingered in Emily's mind for days. The humiliation Rachel had tried to inflict, followed by Edward's unwavering defense, had left a lasting impression on her. Despite the tension, Emily had emerged stronger, more confident in her place by Edward's side. But Rachel's words still echoed in her mind. "People like you don't last long in this world." Emily busied herself with work. Determined to prove Rachel wrong, Edward, too, seemed more focused than ever, his interactions with her becoming even more direct and personal. The shared trust between them deepened, and Emily began to feel like more than just an assistant. She was becoming someone Edward relied on, someone he valued beyond the professional realm. It was late one evening when Edward called her into his office. The skyline of Boston glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city alive with light and movement. Edward sat behind his desk, his posture relaxed but his expression serious. "Emily," he began, gesturing for her to take a seat. "There's something I need to discuss with you." She sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "You've been with the company for a while now, and you've proven yourself in ways I didn't expect. Your dedication, your ability to adapt, it's remarkable." Emily's cheeks flushed at the compliment, but she remained composed. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." He nodded, his gaze steady. "But it's more than that. You've become someone I trust implicitly, and I've been thinking a lot about the future. My future, the company's future." Emily tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Edward hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Rachel and our divorce is moving forward. It's been a long time coming, but the gala made it clear that it's the right decision. I need to close that chapter of my life." Emily nodded, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "I understand. That can't be easy." "It's not," Edward admitted, his tone softening. "But it's necessary, and part of moving forward means making decisions that align with the life I want to build." Emily's heart began to race, though she wasn't entirely sure why. There was something in Edward's tone, in the way he was looking at her, that felt different, more personal. "You've been at the center of a lot of changes in my life recently," Edward continued. "Changes I didn't see coming, and I've realized something important. I don't want to face the future without you." Emily blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. "Edward, I'm not sure I understand," he exhaled, a faint smile playing on his lips. "What I'm trying to say is that you've become more than just my assistant, Emily. You've become someone I deeply respect, someone I admire, and I want you to know how much you mean to me." Her breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined this moment, never considered the possibility that Edward might feel something beyond professional admiration for her. It was overwhelming, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Edward, I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything right now," he said gently. "I just needed you to know, whatever happens, I want you to stay, here, with me. You're an essential part of my life now, Emily." The sincerity in his words left her speechless. She looked away, trying to gather her thoughts. She had spent so much time focused on proving herself, on navigating the challenges of Edward's world, that she hadn't stopped to consider the possibility of something more. But before she could respond, Edward's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting to one of irritation. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," he said, his tone apologetic. Emily nodded, rising from her seat. "Of course. Thank you for everything you said." Edward stood as well, his gaze softening. "Think about it, Emily. That's all I ask." She left the office in a daze, her mind racing. Edward's words replayed in her head, each one stirring a whirlwind of emotions. She wasn't sure what to feel. Gratitude, fear, hope, maybe all three. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Emily realized that her world was changing once again. The lines between professional and personal were blurring, and she wasn't sure where they would lead. But one thing was certain. Edward's decision to open his heart to her had set something in motion, something that could redefine everything they had built together. The morning after Edward's heartfelt confession, Emily arrived at the office with her thoughts in turmoil. She replayed his words over and over in her mind, dissecting every nuance, every pause. "You've become more than just my assistant." How could she focus on work when the most powerful man she'd ever known had just opened his heart to her? As she stepped off the elevator, Emily felt the weight of every gaze, whether it was her own self-consciousness or the whispers that always seemed to follow her. The air felt heavier today. She pushed forward, determined to keep her head down and stay professional. Whatever Edward's feelings were, she couldn't let them distract her from her responsibilities. Edward, however, had other plans. "Emily," his voice called from his office door, startling her before she had a chance to set down her bag. He was impeccably dressed, as always, but his demeanor seemed more composed, almost calm in a way that contrasted with her own restless energy. "Can you come in for a moment?" "Of course," she said, slipping her notebook under her arm and walking toward him. Her pulse quickened as she entered his office, the familiar scent of leather and cedarwood grounding her in the moment. He gestured for her to sit, closing the door behind them. "I know I put a lot on you last night," he began, his voice measured but sincere. "And I don't want to pressure you, but there's something I need to say, and I can't wait any longer." Emily's heart hammered in her chest. "Edward, He held up a hand, stopping her gently. "Let me finish first." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Edward leaned against his desk, his eyes fixed on hers. "I've spent my life building this company, creating a world where I thought I'd be untouchable. But the truth is, none of it matters without the right people by my side. For years I thought Rachel was that person, but I was wrong. And then you walked into my life and everything changed." Emily's breath hitched, the intensity of his gaze making it impossible to look away. "I've watched you face every challenge with grace and determination," he continued. "You've shown me what real loyalty, honesty, and strength look like. And somewhere along the way I realized that you're not just someone I want in my professional life. You're someone I want in my personal life, too." She blinked, stunned into silence as he reached into his pocket. The sight of the small velvet box in his hand sent a wave of disbelief through her. This couldn't be happening. Edward opened the box, revealing a simple yet stunning diamond ring. "Emily Alvarez, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Emily stared at the ring, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. She felt the weight of the moment, the magnitude of what he was asking. And yet, amidst the whirlwind of emotions, one feeling stood out: uncertainty. "Edward," she began, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." He smiled softly, his expression unshaken. "Say whatever's in your heart." She looked down at her hands, trying to find the right words. "I'm incredibly grateful for everything you've done for me, and I admire you more than I can put into words. But I need to be honest with you. This is all so sudden, and I don't think I'm ready to take this step." "Not yet." Edward's smile faltered, but he quickly masked his disappointment. "I understand," he said, his tone kind, but tinged with sadness. "This wasn't meant to pressure you. I just wanted you to know how I feel." Emily met his gaze, her own eyes glistening. "I care about you, Edward, but you're going through so much right now. Your divorce, the company. I think you need time to figure out what you really want before we can even consider something like this." He nodded slowly, his respect for her evident in the way he accepted her words without argument. "You're right," he said softly. "I've been moving too fast, but I hope you know that my feelings for you won't change." Emily's chest tightened, a mix of relief and guilt washing over her. "Thank you for understanding," she said quietly. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Emily kept her head down, focusing on her tasks and avoiding unnecessary interactions. She couldn't shake the image of the ring from her mind, nor the look in Edward's eyes when she had turned him down. She knew she had made the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. When the office finally emptied for the evening, Edward approached her desk, his expression gentle. "Emily," he said, his voice low, "I just wanted to thank you for being honest with me. It means more than you know." She offered him a small smile. "I'll always be honest with you, Edward. You deserve that." As he walked away, Emily felt a strange sense of closure. The proposal had been a turning point, a moment that forced both of them to confront their emotions and reevaluate their priorities. And while things might never be the same, she couldn't help but feel that they were on the right path, wherever it might lead. The tension following Edward's proposal lingered in the air, subtle but undeniable. Emily carried it with her, feeling the weight of his unspoken emotions every time their paths crossed. Though Edward maintained his professionalism, there was a quiet shift in their interactions, an unspoken understanding that things had changed. Emily, too, struggled to find her balance. She had turned down a man whose kindness and respect she deeply valued, not because she didn't care for him, but because the timing felt wrong. Still, the decision weighed heavily on her heart. She worried about how it might affect their working relationship, and whether Edward truly accepted her reasoning. The office hummed with its usual busyness, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers about her had grown louder. She often caught sidelong glances and hushed conversations as she walked by, their contents just out of earshot. Rachel's attempts to undermine her at the gala had already planted seeds of doubt among some of Edward's staff, and now the rumor mill seemed to be working overtime. One afternoon, Margaret Reynolds approached her desk with a stack of files. The older woman set them down with a calculated thud, her sharp eyes scanning Emily's face. "You're holding up well," Margaret said, her tone neutral but tinged with something that felt like curiosity. Emily straightened her posture, meeting Margaret's gaze. "I try." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. This place isn't for the faint of heart. You've managed to surprise more people than you know." Though Margaret's words were vague, Emily sensed an undercurrent of approval. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster her resolve. She wasn't going to let anyone, or their opinions, deter her. Later that day, as Emily worked on an upcoming presentation, she heard Edward's voice echo from his office. He was on a call, his tone calm but firm. The sound was familiar, yet it sent a pang of guilt through her chest. She hated the thought that she might have caused him even a fraction of discomfort. Her thoughts were interrupted when Edward stepped out of his office, his gaze immediately finding hers. "Emily, do you have a moment?" "Of course," she said, setting her work aside and following him into his office. He closed the door behind her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to check in with you. How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm fine," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" Edward leaned against his desk, his arms crossed. "Because I know how this place can be. And after everything, I want to make sure you're not feeling overwhelmed." Emily hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted, "but I'm managing." A flicker of concern crossed his face. "If there's anything I can do—" "You don't need to do anything, Edward," she interrupted gently. "I appreciate your support, but this is something I have to handle on my own." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I understand, but know that you don't have to face it alone." His words, simple as they were, filled Emily with a sense of reassurance, despite the complexities of their relationship. Edward remained steadfast in his belief in her, and that was something she could hold on to. The rest of the week passed with a steady rhythm. Though the undercurrents of tension remained, Emily threw herself into her work, determined to prove that she was more than just the subject of gossip. But even as she focused on her tasks, she couldn't ignore the occasional pang of doubt that crept in. One evening, as she prepared to leave the office, Rachel appeared in the lobby, her presence as striking as ever. She approached Emily with a calculated grace, her smile sharp enough to cut. "Emily," Rachel said, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "Still working late, I see. How dedicated." Emily clenched her jaw, refusing to rise to the bait. "Is there something I can help you with?" Rachel laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Emily's spine. "Oh no, I just wanted to remind you of something important. You may have Edward's favor now. But don't fool yourself into thinking it will last. Men like him don't settle for people like you." The words were a dagger, but Emily refused to let them pierce her composure. She stood tall, her voice steady. "Edward values loyalty, integrity, and hard work. If that's not enough for you to understand, then that's your problem, not mine." Rachel's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. "We'll see how long that confidence lasts," she said coldly, before turning on her heel and walking away. Emily exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. Rachel's venomous words were meant to rattle her, but they only served to strengthen her resolve. She had come too far to let someone like Rachel tear her down. As she stepped into the cool night air, Emily felt a surge of determination. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't going to let fear or doubt define her. She had made her choice, and she would stand by it, no matter what challenges lay in her path. The tension that had surrounded Emily since the gala began to ease as the days turned into weeks. Edward seemed to respect the boundaries she had set, their professional dynamic gradually settling back into place. Though there were moments of unspoken understanding between them, they worked together seamlessly, as if nothing had changed. For Emily, the clarity was a relief. Her focus remained on her work, and on proving her worth to those who doubted her. Despite the whispers and occasional icy stares, she had carved out a space for herself in Edward's world. Every task completed, every challenge overcome, reinforced her belief that she belonged here. But with the dust settling, Edward seemed to shift his focus as well. His energy turned toward the company's future, and he began taking on initiatives that required a more personal touch. It wasn't unusual for him to call Emily into his office late in the day, brainstorming new strategies or discussing potential partnerships. These moments, though purely professional, carried a renewed sense of camaraderie. One evening, as they wrapped up another long discussion about an upcoming merger, Edward leaned back in his chair and studied her thoughtfully. "You've come a long way, Emily," he said. "I don't think I say it enough, but I'm proud of you." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her notepad to avoid his gaze. "Thank you, Edward. That means a lot." He smiled faintly. "I mean it. I don't think this company would be where it is right now without your hard work." Emily glanced up, her expression softening. "You're the one steering the ship. I'm just helping to keep things on course." "You're doing far more than that," he replied, "and I hope you know how much I value you, not just as my assistant, but as someone I trust completely." The sincerity in his words left her momentarily speechless. For all the challenges they'd faced together, it was moments like these that reminded her why she'd taken this leap of faith. Edward's belief in her was a constant source of motivation, even when self-doubt threatened to creep in. As the weeks progressed, Emily found herself taking on more responsibilities. Edward began involving her in higher-level meetings, introducing her to key stakeholders, and even seeking her advice on decisions that could shape the company's future. It was a level of trust she hadn't anticipated, but one she embraced wholeheartedly. But the more involved she became, the more she began to notice something shifting within Edward. His determination to move forward, both professionally and personally, was evident in everything he did. He spoke with more conviction, made bolder decisions, and seemed to carry himself with a renewed sense of purpose. One day, as they reviewed plans for a major corporate event, Edward paused mid-sentence and leaned back in his chair. "You've been quiet," he remarked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something on your mind?" Emily hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No, I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past few months. It feels like things are finally starting to settle." Edward nodded slowly. "I think you're right. It's been a whirlwind, hasn't it?" She smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever regret taking this job?" The question surprised her. "Not for a second," she said firmly. "It's been challenging, yes, but it's also been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life." Edward's lips curved into a small smile. "I'm glad to hear that, because I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hung in the air, heavier than he probably intended. Emily looked away, unsure of how to respond. She felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, pride, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, as the corporate event approached. Emily threw herself into planning, determined to make it a success. The gala was set to be a showcase of the company's achievements, a celebration of everything they had built together. Edward trusted her to handle the details, and she was determined not to disappoint him on the night of the event, As she surveyed the grand ballroom, Emily felt a swell of pride. The room was alive with energy, the culmination of weeks of hard work. Edward stood at the center of it all, his presence commanding as he greeted guests and delivered a speech that left the room in awe as the evening wound down. Edward found Emily near the edge of the room, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "You've outdone yourself," he said, his voice warm. "This is perfect." Emily smiled, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "Thank you, but it was a team effort." "Maybe," he replied, his gaze steady. "But none of this would have been possible without you." For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of conversation fading into the background. Emily felt a strange sense of calm, as if everything she had worked for was finally falling into place. As she left the event that night, Emily couldn't help but feel that a new chapter was beginning, not just for the company, but for herself. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The aftermath of the corporate event brought a sense of accomplishment that resonated through the office. Emily had proven herself not only capable but integral to Edward's vision for the company's future. She felt more confident than ever in her role. Yet there was an undeniable shift in her relationship with Edward. The ease with which they worked together carried an unspoken connection, one that went beyond professional respect. One afternoon, as Emily sat at her desk finalizing details for a new project, Edward appeared in the doorway. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his tone warm but purposeful. Emily looked up, startled but nodding quickly. "Of course." He gestured for her to follow him, and they walked down the hallway to the private lounge, a place they'd shared meaningful conversations before. The room was quiet, bathed in soft light, a retreat from the bustling office. Edward poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Emily before sitting across from her. "I've been reflecting a lot lately," Edward began, his gaze steady, "about the choices I've made, the direction I'm heading, and what matters most to me." Emily sipped her coffee, her heart racing slightly. "That's natural after everything you've been through," she said carefully. He nodded, setting his cup down. "You've been a big part of those reflections, Emily, and I think it's time I was honest with you. Not just about how I feel, but about what I want moving forward." Her breath caught, but she remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I've realized that I've been clinging to the past for far too long," Edward said, his voice low but resolute. "The failure of my marriage, the mistakes I've made, they've weighed on me for years. But now I feel like I'm finally ready to let go of that and focus on what's ahead." Emily nodded, unsure of where he was leading but listening intently. "I've also realized," he continued, "that the people I surround myself with, the ones I trust, are what give me purpose. And you, Emily, are at the center of that." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her cup. "Edward, Let me finish," he interrupted gently, a faint smile on his lips. "When I asked you to marry me, it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. I meant every word. But I also understand why you said no. You were right. I needed time to sort through my own life before I could think about building something new with someone else." Emily's chest tightened at the sincerity in his tone. "I wasn't trying to push you away," she said softly. "I just wanted to make sure you were ready." "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "And now I am." She looked up, startled by the conviction in his voice. "Edward, before you say anything," he interrupted again, "I'm not asking you for an answer right now. I just needed you to know how I feel, and to thank you for your honesty, your support, and your patience. You've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Emily's mind raced, torn between the professional boundaries they'd worked so hard to maintain and the undeniable connection that had grown between them. She cared for Edward deeply, but the stakes felt impossibly high. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means a lot." Edward smiled softly, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "That's all I needed to hear." They finished their coffee in companionable silence before returning to the office. But the conversation lingered in Emily's mind for the rest of the day, a reminder of how far they'd come and the uncharted territory that lay ahead. That evening, as Emily walked home, she found herself reflecting on her journey. When she had first met Edward, she never could have imagined the twists and turns their relationship would take. He had been a stranger, a man whose world was as distant from hers as the stars. Yet now, he felt like someone she couldn't imagine her life without. But the path they were on was far from straightforward. Emily knew she needed time to process everything, to consider what she truly wanted. Could she take the leap into something deeper with Edward? Or would their connection be better left as a partnership built on trust and respect? As she reached her apartment, Emily looked up at the night sky, the city lights glinting like stars. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. Her life had been irrevocably changed by Edward Stone, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. One step at a time, the days following Edward's heartfelt confession were marked by a quiet tension, not of unease, but of anticipation. Emily threw herself into her work as usual, but her thoughts often drifted to their conversation in the lounge. Edward's words lingered in her mind, carrying a weight she couldn't easily shake. She cared for him, she knew that much, but stepping into something deeper meant risking everything: her job, her carefully cultivated independence, and even her sense of self. The stakes felt impossibly high, and yet, the idea of walking away from him felt equally unbearable. Edward, for his part, respected her need for space. He didn't press her for answers or revisit the subject, focusing instead on their work and the many demands of running his company. Yet his actions spoke volumes. Every time he sought her opinion in a meeting, every time he thanked her for her efforts, every time his gaze lingered a little too long, it was clear his feelings hadn't wavered. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave the office, Edward appeared at her desk. He looked unusually casual, his tie loosened and his expression softer than usual. "Do you have plans tonight?" he asked. His voice carrying a hint of hesitation. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Not really. Why?" He smiled faintly. "There's a new exhibit at the art museum I think you'd like. It's not far from here. I was wondering if you'd join me." The invitation surprised her. Edward was rarely one to take time away from work, and the idea of spending an evening with him outside the office felt strange, but also intriguing. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice soft. The walk to the museum was calm and unhurried, a welcome contrast to the fast-paced rhythm of their usual interactions. Edward spoke about the exhibit, a collection of modern art pieces exploring themes of resilience and transformation. Emily listened intently, struck by his depth of knowledge and the passion in his voice. As they wandered through the gallery, the conversation flowed easily. They discussed everything from the bold colors of a particular painting to the symbolism behind an abstract sculpture. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of ease, as though the weight of their unspoken feelings had lifted, if only for a moment. At one point, they paused in front of a striking installation, a series of shattered mirrors arranged to reflect fragments of light across the room. Edward studied the piece, his expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "How something broken can still create something so radiant." Emily glanced at him, her heart catching at the vulnerability in his voice. "It is," she agreed softly. "I think it's a reminder that even when things fall apart, there's still a way to make something new." He turned to her, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how the hardest moments in life can lead to the most meaningful changes." Her breath hitched at the intensity in his eyes. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the softly lit gallery. Emily wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Edward broke the silence, his voice gentle. "I'm not trying to rush you, Emily. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm here, and I'll respect your choice." She nodded, her emotions swirling. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." They finished the evening with a quiet dinner at a nearby bistro, their conversation light but meaningful. Edward spoke about his plans for the company's future, while Emily shared stories from her childhood, moments of struggle and triumph that had shaped her into the person she was. The intimacy of the evening left her feeling both comforted and conflicted. As Edward walked her to her apartment, the night air crisp and cool, Emily felt a pang of uncertainty. She stopped at the steps leading to her door, turning to face him. "Edward," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've said. About us." He watched her intently, his expression open and patient. "And I don't have all the answers yet," she admitted, "but I know that I care about you, more than I ever expected to." A small smile tugged at his lips. "That's enough for me," he said softly. "For now." The vulnerability in his voice broke down the last of her defenses. Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding, and placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you for giving me time," she said. "And for being so, you." Edward chuckled lightly, the sound warm and reassuring. "I don't know how else to be." As they said goodnight, Emily felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was beginning to realize that perhaps it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about taking the leap, one step at a time, and trusting that the pieces would fall into place. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope, not just for her future, but for their future together. The following days felt lighter, as though the unspoken tension between Emily and Edward had finally lifted. Their interactions carried a renewed sense of ease, and while they maintained the professionalism that defined their working relationship, there was an unmissable undercurrent of understanding between them. It wasn't just the way Edward sought her input, or the lingering moments of silence filled with unspoken words. It was the quiet certainty that they were building something, step by step. One afternoon, Emily sat at her desk, reviewing materials for an upcoming partnership meeting. The rhythmic clicking of her keyboard was interrupted by Edward's voice. "Emily, do you have a moment?" She looked up to find him standing in the doorway of his office, his expression unreadable but calm. "Of course," she said, rising from her chair and following him inside. He gestured for her to sit, then leaned against the edge of his desk, his arms crossed casually. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," he began, his tone steady. Emily's stomach tightened slightly. "What is it?" Edward paused, his gaze meeting hers with a mix of seriousness and warmth. "I've been reflecting on everything we've been through, the challenges, the growth, and the decisions we've had to make. And I realized something important. This company isn't just about me anymore. It's about the people who've helped me shape it, the people I trust to carry it forward." Emily tilted her head slightly, unsure of where he was leading. "You've become an essential part of that, Emily," Edward continued. "Your dedication, your perspective. It's changed the way I see not only the business but my own role in it. I want to offer you something more. A promotion." Her eyes widened in surprise. "A promotion?" "Yes," he said with a faint smile. "You've more than proven yourself capable of handling greater responsibility. I want you to take on a leadership role, overseeing operations, strategy, and continuing to work closely with me." Emily blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. "Edward, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied simply, "because you've earned this." Her heart swelled with pride, and she couldn't help but smile. "Yes," she said firmly. "Thank you. I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Edward said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "You've exceeded every expectation I've had. This is just the beginning." As they finalized the details of her new role, Emily felt a sense of purpose unlike anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just about the promotion. It was about the trust Edward had placed in her, the recognition of her hard work, and the belief that she could contribute in a meaningful way. That evening, as she packed up her things, Edward appeared at her desk. "Would you let me buy you dinner?" he asked, his tone light but sincere. "I think a celebration is in order." Emily hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'd like that." They found themselves at a quiet, cozy restaurant on the edge of the city, the kind of place that felt intimate without being overbearing. Over plates of delicious food and glasses of wine, their conversation flowed effortlessly. They spoke about their plans for the company, their shared vision for the future, and the journey that had brought them to this point. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned more personal. Edward leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Emily, I want you to know something. Regardless of what happens, whether professionally or personally, you've made an indelible mark on my life. I'll always be grateful for that." Her chest tightened at his words, and she met his gaze with equal sincerity. "You've changed my life too, Edward, in ways I never could have imagined." They left the restaurant under the glow of the city lights, walking side by side in comfortable silence. When they reached her apartment building, Edward turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I know we've taken things slowly, and I respect that, but I need you to know that my feelings haven't changed. I'm still here, whenever you're ready." Her heart swelled at the vulnerability in his words. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "I know," she said quietly, and I think I might be ready soon." Edward's smile was small but genuine, and in that moment, the weight of unspoken promises seemed to lift. He placed a hand over hers briefly, a gesture of reassurance and patience. "Good night, Emily," he said, his voice warm. "Good night, Edward," she replied, watching as he walked away. As she entered her apartment, Emily felt a profound sense of peace. The road they had traveled together had been anything but smooth, but it had brought them to a place of mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it, both as Edward's trusted partner in the company, and perhaps one day as something more,